Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Thank you all so much for joining us for this very essential and timely conversation. My name is Itika, and I'm a deputy editor at Rest of World based in Bangalore, India. I am joined today by Dr. Rachel Adams, who is the CEO and co-founder of the Global Center on AI Governance, which is focused on building inclusive and ethical approach to AI governance. She's also the author of the 2024 book, The New Empire of AI, The Future of Global Inequity. Welcome, Rachel. We will be spending the next 45 minutes or so discussing the risk of AI in war. We will focus on disinformation and deepfakes, the role of AI in modern day war, why it started, what's happening right now, and where we are headed in the future. Just to set the context, over the last couple of weeks, we have had our social media feeds flooded with videos and images generated using AI, many of which are fake. New York Times recently identified 110 unique AI-generated videos and images about the Gulf War. And we've seen everything from Burj Khalifa on fire to explosions in Tel Aviv and American military vessels being bombarded. Rachel, before we dive deep into AI, I want to talk about technology as a whole. We are living in a very unique moment right now where experts are saying that this is the most number of active conflicts happening simultaneously since World War II. And while all the traditional methods of warfare are being deployed, there is also a tech layer to modern day war. Can you talk to us and set the stage a little bit about the role that technology plays in wars at the moment?
Thank you so much, Itika. It's such a pleasure to be here. I'm sure, like many of you, Rest of World is a very, very important platform for me and for much of the work that I do. And thank you for the invitation. I do think this is a very, very important conversation, and I imagine a conversation we're going to keep having over the coming months and over the coming years. You've asked me to speak a little bit about how AI is being used in modern warfare. And I think you're right to point to the fact that this feels like in our lifetimes, perhaps the most unstable the world has ever been. And for someone like me that's working on issues of global inequality and global governance of AI, this feels deeply worrying that this technology is arriving at a time in the world where the global institutions that we need so sorely to help govern it in the interest of the public globally, their power is being undermined. And part of that is wrapped up with artificial intelligence, and it's very much wrapped up with social media. Perhaps I can take us back. Much of my earlier work was in freedom of expression and access to information, and these human rights being very central rights to the emergence of global ideas of a democratic world order. So after the atrocities of the Second World War and the Holocaust, there was the first UN conference on freedom of information, which led into the development of access to information as a human right. And it was very much about how journalists and the international community need to have access to information about what is going on in countries around the world in order for us to be able to act on and to address atrocities that may be happening. And it was also this recognition that authoritarian regimes rely on a very kind of tight control of media and information flows. And the antidote to that was we need to liberalize access to information. So I think it's an incredible moment historically where that very kind of emphasis on the liberalization of information as the kind of key to peace and democracy is now starting to undo itself in really, really critical ways. So I think, we need to understand here that information warfare, narrative warfare is not something new, and AI is not kind of creating some new factor. It's not creating a new sort of paradigm within this. It's an accelerant to a set of already existing problems. And we can talk a little bit about the kind of AI and misinformation and disinformation that we're seeing at the moment. I think more broadly, because you asked me around AI and warfare, we're seeing this on three broad terrains. So one is the information space, which we're going to really talk a bit more about, around kind of the generation, dissemination, targeting, amplification of persuasive and emotive content. We're also seeing the use of AI as a military decision support tool in terms of intelligence analysis, surveillance, planning, and targeting. So that's as a kind of decision-making tool by military actors. And then we're seeing it in the weapons itself. So that's the kind of third layer. So semi-autonomous or entirely autonomous weapon systems, which in all the recent conflicts that we've seen around the world, Ukraine, Russia, Israel, Gaza, we've seen these systems being deployed in really kind of critical ways. So I think it's not just about, AI and killer robots and the loss of accountability that we're so concerned about here, but it's also how AI embedded within chains of decision making can compress time, can make things move much more quickly. It can narrow human judgment, and of course it can kind of generate this bias in machine output. So we become overconfident in whatever machine generated recommendations the AI system may recommend, and of course we know that these can be biased against particularly vulnerable populations.
That's very interesting, Rachel. And I'd want to focus on the first piece for this conversation, which is the information space and generation and acceleration. Could you maybe explain with some example, doesn't have to be war related, but where, you think you have seen how AI for misinformation sort of creates these biases or accelerates the spread of misinformation and deepfakes, and also like the real world implications of this acceleration?
Yeah, so I think one of the first things that we're seeing is, of course, the sheer volume of false or misleading wartime images or information being shared. So this is AI generated clips, of course, that present kind of footage from conflict regions, a lot of kind of satellite images, but often we're also seeing kind of old footage from other conflicts being presented as kind of new and relevant and kind of breaking news, and they might be kind of relabeled by AI systems. So it's not always that a deep fake is being created. It could be that AI is being used to resurface old footage and present it as something new. So AFP has done some really good kind of recent fact checking on the conflicts that are going on at the moment, showing kind of like these fabricated satellite images, AI generated attack footage, the mislabeled videos, and then all the kind of fake posts that are related particularly to political leaders. And I think that's a kind of whole space of disinformation in itself. I think the other thing to really stress is the kind of emotional engineering that is going on with the dissemination and production of this kind of content. It's really trying to invoke fear or feelings of kind of triumph or revenge, or drive out feelings of helplessness. There's a range of different kind of feelings that some of this content is driving to produce, and very often it feels like that's the whole point of much of it, is to intensify often polarizing emotions or manipulate people's emotions about the conflicts and what's going on, shaping international opinion, and so forth. I think what we have to remember is this affects people inside the conflict zones much more, who might be kind of making decisions about where they need to move, where they need to go, where aid might be available, where shelter might be available. So for me, this is some of the most kind of critical areas where, yes, on the kind of international community side, we need to have information about what's going on in order to make decisions about how and whether to intervene, how to put pressure on our political leaders to do the right thing. But for those inside the conflict, it's much more a kind of life and death question, where if there's disinformation circulating about where they can get shelter or aid or so forth, where they can find family members, it becomes something much more critical.
Very interesting perspective from, what this, we watch it from the outside and we often think about what it's doing to us. But for those who are in the eye of the storm, it can be even more damaging. Rachel, a lot of your work is focused on inequity and how that is a threat to the potential of what AI can achieve. Your book focused on that. In terms of this AI-generated deepfakes and misinformation in the middle of a conflict, can you speak a little bit about how do these inequities play out, and what is the damage in the moment, and the larger damage that such AI-related misinformation can cause in terms of inequity, specifically maybe with the focus on gender?
Yeah, thank you. I think this is a great question. So much of my work has been looking at global inequality. So inequality in countries around the world in terms of how they're able to access in news, AI systems, or how social media or platforms may be regulated, and to what extent in these parts of the world. And, in the global south, many countries have kind of historically been vulnerable to information manipulation. They've had weaker media ecosystems, or they're newer democracies, and they've experienced external narrative control. This has really been, an issue that's at the heart of my work around decolonization. Is it's who gets to write history, whose narratives and experiences are written over by official, usually Western accounts. Now, what AI does is enables that writing over in ways that deny or occlude or invisibilize authorship and therefore accountability. So it's not clear who's doing that writing over, but it's still happening. And of course, when truth becomes contestable and uncertain, it's those with the greatest institutional power, whether it's platforms, particular states, particular militaries, those are the institutions and the people that are better positioned to assert their version of events, which can sideline citizens and civilians. It particularly sidelines local journalists, and I'll speak to that in a minute, and smaller, less powerful states. So for me, a lot of these questions are wrapped up with critical questions about power. Who gets to define truth in times of war? Whose voices are being trusted? Whose realities are being dismissed? Now, this isn't a kind of expressly conflict-related example, but in South Africa recently, our Competitions Commission did this kind of huge online intermediation platforms market inquiry from like 2023 to 2025, which concluded that Google's search algorithms and advertising systems were systematically favoring global media and publishers over local South African media. So local news outlets were being downranked and like less visible, and this obviously had impacts as well financially in terms of the advertising revenue. But I think it's a really, really important kind of example for showing how the control over information and information warfare is not just about who is proliferating this content and who is or isn't censoring it. It's also about infrastructure and ranking systems. And this is where we have kind of seen historical inequalities with news, media, journalist content coming from the global South, which becomes very difficult because then we are unable to see a balanced view of what's happening. Oh, and shall I quickly, sorry, the gender question, because I think this is this is very interesting and one that I think is very often skipped over in discussions around conflict. And historically, women have really borne the brunt of conflict, often in terms of sexual violence, but also women play a very, very important role in peace building, a really kind of significant role. So I think what we're seeing now is that the misinformation, so inaccurate but not necessarily designed to manipulate, and disinformation, which is designed to manipulate, is that it interacts with existing gender norms in countries and vulnerabilities and power struggles. And of course, much of you know the kind of key ideas and rationale behind some of what's happening in the Gulf is over these kind of contestable gender-based issues. Women are disproportionately targeted by reputational attacks. So that might be women who are in public-facing roles or female journalists. They're particularly vulnerable to be discredited, female activists and politicians as well. And fake content might focus on kind of sexuality and morality and their respectability. We know that 95% of deepfakes target women, and that connects to what happens in conflict settings as well. So this kind of sexualized misinformation can be weaponized. So sort of fabricated claims about sexual behavior or non-consensual sexual imagery that can be shared, or humiliation-based propaganda. So it's a kind of strategic form of gendered harm that can be particularly problematic and powerful in these kind of conflict contexts. So it might kind of result in silencing and withdrawal from public life of female leaders, politicians, activists, and so forth. We have fewer female women's voices shaping the narrative about war. So it really does impact as well. And I think it's something that's very, very often kind of forgotten in these conversations.
Yeah, just give me 1 second to fix something happening with our video, Rachel. I'll just take a minute to find you again. Rachel, have you turned off your video?
No, mine is still on.
Okay, you'll have to just give me a second, guys. Please bear with me.
No problem.
While I fix this, maybe I should just continue with my next question. This is still not resolved. I'm sorry if your view is distorted. We are trying to fix this at our end as soon as possible. And I think it should work. Okay, great. Thanks. Thank you, Christine. Right. The next question, I mean, Rachel, we have now set the sort of, the stage in terms of the damage that it does and the various ways in which harm can come. I want to move on a little bit now to talk about accountability, because we are in this moment where there are several platforms, there are several AI tools that are all in a way directly or indirectly aiding and advancing this harm. There is a lot of conversation about who should be responsible, whether it should be governments that are making policies to curtail this kind of misinformation from spreading, whether it is platforms that should be held accountable. In your view, where does the accountability rest?
Thank you. It's a really interesting question about accountability, because on the one hand, what we have is that the latest AI tools, generative AI, large language models, they really critically reduce the barriers to entry for creating and distributing at scale fake, propagandist disinformation. But the infrastructure through which this disinformation is created and spread is largely held by a very small handful of companies. So in this way, it makes the question of accountability in some ways more straightforward, that we have to be looking at the frontier model developers, and we have to be looking at the platforms through which this content is shared and spread. And we have to be thinking about, well, what do governments need to do this? There's a kind of layered approach, and I think that one of my worries is that we're trying to outsource some of the work of authenticating content and ensuring truth within our global information ecosystems to AI. And I think that creates this kind of recursive trust problem, that we're relying on models that we can't trust to verify models that we can't trust. Yeah, we can get to kind of the points around what can individuals do, maybe just to kind of go
right after this. Yes.
Sure. I think we can go to kind of looking at what can platforms do, and platforms being the kind of key place through which this content is spread. At the moment, we are having kind of disclosure rules with labeling in terms of like YouTube and TikTok and Meta. They have like synthetic media disclosure guidances and policies. I think this is not applied consistently, and we know that the much of the problems around social media use in conflict contexts has been because social media companies have not put enough content moderation resources behind the dissemination and publication of content in outside of the US, simply outside of the US, where there's a more there's a richer cultural context, there's more languages being used, there's more local kind of dialects being used. And so the AI technologies, takedown technologies, are not so accurate in these contexts, and platforms have simply not put enough resources, human resources, behind ensuring the kind of credibility of content in these places. So platforms have a responsibility not to profit, right, from the virality of content that goes completely viral on their sites, and model developers. This is very, very important. So this will be like the kind of OpenAIs, the Anthropics, and those companies on which fake AI generated content will be created, they have a responsibility to kind of build traceability in order to trace where content was made and how it was made, to red team their models for use in conflict contexts, to create crisis protocols for high risk deployments. And many of these companies have kind of disclosure reports around where they've picked up problematic use of their products in places around the world, but it's not being done to the kind of degree that would ensure that these tools might be used safely around the world. We've seen that. So this is where we are going to need to rely on governments to take a more proactive approach and to set standards which platforms and model developers need to adhere to, because at the moment we're just relying on platforms and model developers and their idea of what doing good in the world with their products and services looks like. So it's not human rights based, it's not equality based, it's in fact much more market based, and that's why you have more resources going behind content moderation in the US as opposed to in Myanmar or Ethiopia and Tigray, where we've seen terrible atrocities being inflamed by social media. And I think the other thing to just emphasize is that this is not and should not be seen entirely as a kind of technical failure. This is also a governance failure. And we need to think about a stronger rights-based ecosystem. And this is where, I talk about our project, the Global Index on Responsible AI, which is measuring what countries around the world are doing to ensure human rights are protected as AI proliferates in their jurisdictions. And we measure 135 plus countries, almost 40 countries in Africa are included, the majority of Latin America and the Caribbean, most of Asia, a good part of Europe. So it's a very, very inclusive study from a geographical perspective, but it assesses, how far are governments putting in place requirements for transparency, accountability, public oversight, access to redress and remedy for AI-related harms that occur.
I was going to ask you about the Global Index on Responsible AI, and I know that you're still working on it, your team is still working on it, but by when do you think, Rachel, we would be able to access this index? Because all information about AI tends to be so opaque that we're always on the lookout for someone who's done a deep dive. And could you also speak to, I understand you cannot share the takeaways at the moment, but what is the objective that you started this working on this global index with, and what do you hope to achieve through it?
Yeah, thank you so much. So this is a project that the Global Centre on AI Governance has been doing for a number of years now. We published the first edition of the Global Index on Responsible AI in 2024, which measured responsible AI efforts in 138 countries and jurisdictions around the world. It is a ranking, so it does rank countries, and the idea is to enable countries to track progress over time, but also to kind of prompt advocacy efforts globally so that advocacy groups in country are able to have a kind of solid base of information and evidence with which to advocate for change. My dear colleague Fiona has put some information about the first edition in the chat. It is the largest study on responsible AI around the world, and it's certainly the most globally inclusive because we cover all these different countries. The data is collected by experts in each of these countries who complete this very long comprehensive questionnaire that takes them about 3 months, and it covers everything from kind of children's rights in AI through to AI in the environment, whether there's any unacceptable risk, any use of AI in countries that are above acceptable risk levels, It also looks, we're moving now into the second edition, Itika, which is, I think, really what you're asking about. The second edition of this index is being published in July of this year at the AI for Good Global Summit that's taking place at the beginning of July. And this year we've sort of updated our conceptual framework to include this kind of category of, is there cases of AI use in your country above the acceptable risk level? We're also looking much more critically at laws and frameworks governing disinformation, online violence, including online violence against women and children. And it's also got a kind of whole dimension of indicators around public sector use of AI. And what's interesting for this conversation is that in the first edition, when we were collecting information about what frameworks and policies existed in countries where we found legal frameworks protecting human rights at risk from AI, they often didn't apply in military contexts. And so we've included in this second edition a kind of sub-indicator that asks, does this policy or framework, particularly does this law, does this regulation apply even in military contexts? So we should have some really, really kind of rich information about what protections are in place where, and just how vulnerable communities and people are around the world.
I really look forward to the index, and I'm sure, I mean, with this new context that you're talking about, it will be a very valuable asset in helping us make sense of what's happening in this moment. I want to now talk about, like, so before I actually move on to the next question, I want to tell all our attendees that they can drop their questions in the chat box. I am looking at it and I will start including your questions. Ask Rachel your questions. But when we were when we sent out invitations for this event, Rachel, one of the things that we asked potential participants was, what is the number one thing that you want out of the session? And most people's question was, ask was that they want tools to identify AI generated deepfakes on their own. And, we can discuss about accountability at length, but I think it's also a time right now where we also need to take our safety and security a little bit more seriously and in our own hands. So could you share any sort of, practical tips on maybe what you do when you see a video on your stream? What are the top 3 or 4 or 5 things that you check? And just to add to that question, are there any tools? Because I see a lot of my friends now using AI to check if it's AI, which is harmful in its own way, because the responses vary from either identifying it as AI or generating another fake news. So could you help us, or journalists for sure, but even everyone who's here, give us some practical tips on how to identify a deep fake? What are the main gives?
Yeah, absolutely. And I must say, I tend not to rely on AI to check whether something is AI generated. I think there are very good technologies being developed, but I feel like you have to go and check that again. And so you may as well just check the first time. Although I must say there is a very good AI tool that I use to check whether in academic work, whether citations that are included in a research paper are real or not, and that's often to determine whether AI has been used in academic writing. But let me go to the kind of how to detect deep fakes. I think very often we're kind of looking for very obvious visual clues like 6 fingers, but I think we're getting to a stage where AI is.
Oh yeah, I am surprised at how quickly that issue has been solved in so many tools which were showing 6 fingers until December, and now they are not.
Yeah. AI is increasing its kind of capacities and its seamlessness so much. So I think kind of relying on visual intuition alone is not going to be sufficient. I think you have to kind of verify through context and provenance authentication. But yeah, some of the kind of layperson clues would be inconsistent text or insignia, implausible kind of lighting and reflections, weird movements at the side of frames, and then also kind of very emotional context or content or audios, like theatrical kind of sound effects or music that might be going on in the background. Lack of specific time and place is very important. And then suspiciously generic, perfect imagery, even if that's of something quite devastating. So the kind of 5 things, I think, is be wary of footage that appears first on kind of anonymous, highly partisan or low history accounts. So where are you finding this information first? And is it from a kind of very newly generated website that doesn't seem to have a clear company or author behind it, doesn't seem to be registered anywhere specific, or seems to be promoting a very kind of one-sided view of the issue? So always look for, where does it first come from? Check whether reputable fact checkers or journalists have already geolocated or debunked it. There's some really good fact checking organizations around the world that I think are doing kind of heroic work. And in Africa, there's Africa Check, but there's also AFP that works globally, but comes out of France. There's an interesting one about like watching with the sound off first. So that point I was trying to make about often the sound and the audio can be very, very emotive. And when something is obviously very emotive, you first have to kind of think, is it trying to manipulate me? As I said, the kind of key objective very often is to emotionally manipulate someone. People remember their emotions rather than remember the kind of rational thought behind something. And this is why certain political leaders are very, very popular, because they know to play into that. Look at whether the footage includes a kind of precise claim that can be independently verified, so a place, a date, a building, particular landmarks, and treat screenshots very suspiciously, especially of like official statements, because they're very easy to kind of manipulate. They're not as traceable. So screenshots and something that's been forwarded many times is always something to be particularly wary of.
Very interesting. I mean, I will add 2 to this list, because as a journalist, I am combating a flush of fake news constantly, and not just like online, but also from my friends who often lean on me to verify facts for them. And I am not in wars to be able to tell them, but one is to always go to multiple sources. I feel like I have stopped believing anything that I see in one reel or in one tweet or in one Facebook post, until and unless there are like several sources saying the same things, exact same thing. I will not trust, but that is also not foolproof. As we saw in the last 2-3 days about the news of whether Benjamin Netanyahu is dead or alive, and multiple sources said multiple things. And then the second thing that I lean on is just trusting very verified sources. I understand that lure to trust an Instagram influencer who is suddenly now going to deliver news to you, and that adrenaline rush of like, breaking news and something has just arrived. And But I feel like that also sort of corrupts the brain with too much information. So I tend to sort of only follow very credible, and this is what I tell my friends and my family and people who ask me, to only follow very credible, authentic news outlets for news. And then if there is an information that you see on social, to again go to credible websites and sources to verify it before believing everything, because there is an information overload anyway, and like AI is just exaggerating that situation. I will take a question that my colleague Ananya has shared on chat, Rachel, and I would encourage any other person who wants to ask a question at this point to please drop your question in the chat and we'll come to it. Her question, Ananya's question, is linked to what we are talking about, battling misinformation. And she says, how can countries at a macro level or institutions like schools and workplaces around the world at a micro level equip citizens to identify AI disinformation across culture, language, and so on? And I think this also speaks to your work to an extent, Rachel, because again, like, AI and accountability, and how do we incorporate this at a school and college level and, policy making level? How do we fix AI at these levels?
Yeah, well, thank you. That is a really important question. And perhaps I can just kind of quickly explain why this feels so complicated. Because it's so obvious that these fake AI generated images, audios, news items are incredibly harmful. But part of the reason that governments around the world have really struggled to figure out how do we meaningfully regulate this, apart from the difficulty in holding global platforms, social media platforms, to account, is the whole idea of freedom of expression, that people have the right to express themselves, even if it is in ways that are untruthful. It can be seen as kind of art and creative expression. So it's always been a tricky issue to regulate, partly as well because more authoritarian leading countries readily curb freedom of expression, and internet shutdowns have been a particular tactic that we have seen time and time again in recent conflicts. And so we don't want to be giving states unilateral powers to decide what to censor online content. So this is what makes it very, very tricky. And that's why that question of what is the role of citizens in determining for themselves whether content is real and whether they're going to believe it becomes very, very important. This is also particularly important alongside the kind of cognitive atrophy that we're seeing with the high use of artificial intelligence. So the more people are working with generative AI technologies to do their homework and help them with their work and help them to figure out how to deal with their marriage or whatever it might be, the more people are kind of offloading their cognitive abilities to these machines. So on the one hand, we're having an increasing cognitive offloading to the machines, and at the same time we're seeing that we need to be equipping people with critical skills, critical thinking skills, in order to assess whether what they're seeing is true or not. There's been some very interesting work around the kind of misinformation inoculation. So the idea that people need to be, school children, for example, need to see what kind of and be exposed to a degree of fake AI generated content in order to be able to discern whether it's AI generated in the next instant. So I think more and more, as we are teaching children about the harms of social media, we're going to need to be teaching children and equipping citizens with information like we've just discussed around how to detect misinformation. And I think, this was done a little bit during COVID time. I was living in South Africa at that time, and there were more kind of government-led efforts to help people be able to identify misleading content.
Mm-hmm. Very interesting. While we talk about like how to battle this situation, one of the conversation that keeps coming up, Rachel, is the fact that there should be some sort of gatekeeping of AI tools. And a lot of experts that I have been speaking with recently have brought this up, whether and of course, like a lot of AI leaders have brought this up about whether the West should restrict access to their tools, and whether that is the way to sort of not let it land in the hands of those who could potentially harm or generate harmful content. What is your view on gatekeeping of AI? Do you think that's going to aggravate the problem, or is it going to add to the inequity that you so passionately fight against?
Yeah, this is something that in a slightly different context, still AI related, I discussed a little bit in my book, this idea that there are only a small set of trusted actors who are largely white men from Silicon Valley that should be allowed to manage and handle and make the decisions about the world's most powerful technologies. So I think allowing these companies to be the gatekeepers of information and truth around the world is a very, very problematic idea. And certainly within the African context in which a lot of my work takes place, we want open source technologies. We need to be able to kind of cut the costs to building these technologies. We need to make them more equitable and accessible. So I don't think that kind of gatekeeping for the US companies to be gatekeeping these technologies is really solving the problem at all. I think my view is much more that foundation models and large platforms have a much more heightened responsibility in conflict context, and we've seen these mistakes played out with social media in places like Myanmar and Tigray. But those responsibilities should include kind of layered safeguards, like stronger friction on realistic or sort of seemingly realistic war content, on provenance standards, on crisis response escalation pathways, and cooperation with local fact-checking agencies, protections for journalists and human rights defenders, and much more kind of transparency around how their protocols and procedures and practices work. So I don't think that having these companies be kind of the only companies that can do the kind of development of models I don't think it's going to work. Mm-hmm. And I think the cat's already out the bag. Mm-hmm. We saw that with DeepSeek. And I think there's a lot of benefits to open sourcing that outweigh the potential benefits of having these capabilities locked within a small handful of companies.
Mm-hmm. I have a couple of questions from the chat, but just I want to tuck in one that's related to what you said. So gatekeeping, no. And open source is like the other end of what's happening with the big Western tools at the moment, Rachel. In terms of governance and the opacity of the current Western AI tools, where do you think changes can be made to make these tools? I mean, of course, they won't get absolutely transparent, but to make sure that this power resting in big tech hands is released a little bit. Is there anything that you have thought about in terms of like, policy frameworks or governance frameworks to make it better than what it is in terms of opacity?
Yeah, and I think much of the work that's going on in this space is currently under the kind of umbrella of AI safety. I think there's much more that can be done technically to make the reasoning of these systems more transparent. And there's much more that can be done to safeguard through kind of red teaming and testing and auditing these technologies. Mechanistic interpretability is the kind of engineering term for the technical work to try and make AI systems more transparent in terms of how they work. But I think for me, what we need to see much more of is the kind of AI safety work coming into a much more social technical domain. So really assessing with communities and in societies, how do these technologies perform? What are they being used for? Who are they being used by? And how do we think of much more kind of localized governance techniques and safeguarding mechanisms that fit how these technologies are used in local context? This is the first time we're trying to govern and manage a technology that evolves as it is deployed. Mm-hmm. And so its reliability is much harder to pin down. We don't know that it's going to perform the same every time to the same question. It's going to perform differently in different contexts. And so the kind of science of AI safety and AI evaluation and AI authentication is really still an ongoing there's a lot more that still needs to be done, but we need to do this not just in a technical way.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Right, we are down to our last 9 minutes, and I have a few questions that I will quickly ask. I think not all are very directly applicable to our topic today, but in case, Rachel, you have any insights or information to offer, I'll just read the questions to you. We can briefly address the first one, especially which says, intuitively cognitive offloading, which you mentioned in one of your previous responses, due to AI, makes sense. Do we yet have large-scale studies on how much people are abandoning their abilities to AI and the resultant detriment or enhancement?
Yeah, we have a few emerging studies that have taken place, like the big MIT one that came out sort of last year that looked at the brain scans of people using ChatGPT and people not using ChatGPT and showing just how much less of our brain we're using. So we have some initial studies. We don't have longitudinal, large-scale, cross-society studies. And that is something that the Leverhulme Centre of the Future of Intelligence, which I lead at the University of Cambridge, we're looking to develop and begin a big programme of work around this. And it's so sorely needed. It's so sorely needed when we're thinking about, big questions around democracy and peace, and people can't think for themselves, or we don't know how far AI is changing the ability of people's ability to think for themselves.
Mm-hmm. The next question is, thank you, Obokor, first for enjoying the conversation. We're glad that you're enjoying it. What are your thoughts on the new trend of news aggregators or tech firms which advertise the ability to view different perspectives leaning on a certain topic or leanings on a certain topic?
Oh, is that like kind of community notes like we have on X? Sorry, I'm not that familiar with this.
I believe that's what they are. Yeah, and they replied yes. It's the community.
Yeah, it's an interesting one. I think for somebody that's worked so much in the global south and we talk so much about communities, we have to remember that there are power dynamics and politics within communities, and it's still very often certain active online people whose views get better represented even within these kinds of forums. But the short answer is I've not spent long enough really kind of thinking through whether these are a viable alternative.
And I'll take the last question from the chat and wrap it up in my last question so we can start wrapping up this conversation. The last question is that from the chat is that, are there any best practices or examples globally of countries that are regulating AI as it relates to misinformation and disinformation well, which is also along the lines of what I was going to ask, because we have discussed so much gloom and doom already. Could you talk to us a little bit about what gives you hope in this moment, and maybe example of how AI governance has been done well? Any examples that you have seen in your work in relation to disinformation and misinformation?
Yeah, great question. And I will be able to answer that really well in 3 months when we have the findings, because we have a specific question and indicator on this. And so we'll be able to tell you precisely which countries are doing very well, but also what countries are taking a more innovative, localized approach to this issue. I would say any society that's looking to equip people, citizens, with knowledge and tools in order to kind of question and be skeptical about information is very, very important. I must say that, you know, this is a slightly side note, but the Global Centre on AI Governance did a big study in South Africa to assess what people understood and knew and thought about artificial intelligence. And we were quite shocked to find that 1/3 of people have never heard of AI. Another third of South Africans have heard of AI, but couldn't say what it was at all. So that's almost 2/3 of South Africans don't have any grasp of artificial intelligence. And we interviewed over 3,000 people from all walks of life in their local languages. There's, you know, 11 plus official languages in South Africa. And the other thing we found is, you know, where do people learn about AI? And they learn about AI largely through algorithmically mediated platforms like social media. So that's also hugely problematic. People are not being kind of taught through their workplaces or schools or by government. You know, there's no kind of systematic or very limited systematic teaching around these issues. And given how transformative they are, how much they're changing the world, we really need to see more of that. Very quickly on a good example, and it's not specifically disinformation, but the Online Safety Act in the UK is world leading. And I haven't worked a lot with it. I've worked a little bit with Ofcom, which is the regulator that's looking to enforce it. And I know that they've been very concerned about misinformation and disinformation and people's use of chatbots. And so they seem to me a very kind of tuned in regulator that's really trying to look at what evidence and information is out there. But it is still a really emerging space. So watch this space in 3 months and I'll be able to give a really good answer.
I look forward to that. And you have already promised me off the record, but to put it on the record that you will come back and talk to me about the report once it is out so we can hear more in detail about it. Thank you, everyone. We have reached the end of our conversation. Rachel, thank you so much for joining me today, for helping us decode this moment that we're all living. Thank you, everyone who attended this conversation. Rest of World will continue to host such conversations moving forward about several topics that matter to us, about how tech is impacting businesses, culture, and humans across the world. If you have suggestions on what we should discuss next, please find me on social media, find Rest of World on social media, and let us know. And we try to put up more webinars to address those questions. And Rachel, thank you so much again. We look forward to the index, but also thank you for all the work that you do. It is so essential and so important.